I'm going to talk in this video about some simple ways that you can look for relationships between bird numbers and habitat data. Now, I say bird numbers because you may look at a variety of metrics that are related to what kind of and how many birds are in an environment. And that may be species richness, abundance, and those two metrics are the ones we're going to talk about today. In other videos, we've talked about how to compare birds between two habitats, to compare abundances between two habitats. And now we're going to look to see how we might relate those to habitat variables that you would collect in surveys in different environments. So I'm going to start with a data set called a flat file of a point count survey with distance sampling. This is a type of data entry in a type of file format that's really common for this kind of survey, which includes not only observations of individual species, but numbers of those species and estimates of distances of those species from the observer. We need to capture all of that information, so the level of observation in terms of how this data sheet is organized is each row is a single observation. Compare that to a habitat survey. So you do a point count. You count the birds, you measure their distances, you get numbers of individuals, then you want to do a habitat survey at that point. And when you do a habitat survey, typically, for the kinds of surveys we do for bird counts, each row in that data set that we collect is actually a sample. And so here, let's go back to this birds, point A11, we're calling it plot here, but it's point A11. Is our sample. But we have A11 noted many, many times in this data sheet because there were lots of birds at point A11. Here in this data sheet, point A11 is also a sample. So it's the same spot as A11 where the bird survey was conducted, but it's a single row. And when for a lot of the kinds of analysis that you would want to do, you want to have your samples be your rows. And so that gives us the need to summarize our data in a different way here. And that's pretty easy to do. And in another video, I've shown you how to use pivot tables to do that. And we're going to do that one more time to get the data into format for analysis with habitat data. So what I want to do is I want to get these bird observations into species numbers. I want to know at each point how many species were observed. So I'm going to do that by generating a pivot table. And I start off with making a pivot table by selecting my data sheet, going up to the top of the Excel menu and selecting the Insert toolbar, and then selecting Pivot Table. It will show me what spreadsheet I have highlighted and will by default choose to put it in a new worksheet, and that's what I want to do. And here we are, we're ready to make a pivot table. And so I want the rows in my new data set to be my plots. And so I drag plot down into rows. And I want, if I want to know my abundances, it's pretty straightforward. I can look at my cluster size, which I'm looking at counts of the different birds in the survey. And I can drag that down into the values field and make sure that what it's showing me is the summary. So it's summing up the numbers of the cluster sizes of the birds that I observed. That's pretty straightforward. And we could then take that data and put it into our habitat sheet. If I want to know how many species were in a certain plot, we have to do one more step, or a couple of more steps actually. It's slightly more complicated. We need to next actually add a layer of information called species, and I'm going to put species as columns in the data set. So now we have this matrix basically with samples as rows and species as columns. And so we can actually scroll across and we can see for each point, we now have this summary data where it's showing us how many of these different bird species there were. So, and at the very far end of this pivot table is a grand total. See, these are the same numbers that I did when I plopped my cluster sizes in there. It's summing up the total numbers of individuals in each row. If I want to know numbers of species, I can use something called a count function to count the numbers of cells that have data in them. And so if I simply count the number of cells in row 811 that have any kind of number in them, I'll know how many species there were. And I'm just going to do that right now. It would be very cumbersome and error prone for me to do it for every row in the data set, but let's do that here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So that's my number of species at point A11. I can use a count function. I'm going to call this, I'm going to create a new column of data, species, and I'm going to use a count function. I'm going to use the count A function. So I'm going to tell Excel I want to make a function, I'm going to hit the equal sign, and then I'm going to type in count A. And it says it counts the number of cells in a range that are not empty. And so I enter count A, and then I do an open parentheses, and I select the range of data that I want my function to be looking through. And so I start with the very last species listed in the data set and drag it all the way across to the very first species listed in the data set. I do not include that totals column because that totals column doesn't include information on species. And I get 14, and that's exactly how many I counted. So that's really quick. And the other nice thing is that once you've done this, if you have if you have the same range of data for each row, okay, so it's the same number of columns for each row that you're wanting to be searching through, you can simply drag this formula down and get your results. And I usually just double check to make sure. So for this row, it's counting cells B51. So here's B51, yes, all the way through BQ51, which BQ is my yellow warbler, 51, okay? And so it's actually, it's moved the cell references according to each row, and these are my counts. So this column is now showing us how many species were at each plot. I can then take this information and add it to my habitat sheet. Now I need to be careful when I do this. A couple things I need to be careful of. One, I want to make sure that I'm pasting the values instead of the formula. If I just paste the formula, there aren't references, the cell, it doesn't know what to look for. So I want to paste the values that I got from that formula. And I always want to make sure I'm also, I go back to my pivot table, I want to make sure I know which plots that these values are connected to. Because if I get this associated with the wrong plots, then the data are meaningless. So I go select my plots here in the pivot table, and I copy and I paste that information. Oops, I paste it here. Okay. I can also take that abundance data and paste it. Show these grand totals. I'm going to make sure I'm pasting values as well. Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to do is I want to just check and make sure that these bird numbers are aligning with the same plots where we have habitat data. So I'm going to copy these data here, these columns, my plots, my species richness values, and my abundance values, and I'm actually going to insert them into right next to the very first column of data in the habitat data set. And so all I'm doing now is I'm double checking to make sure that all of these plot numbers are the same. And they are. So I can now get rid of this plot column. And what I have now are bird data for, I'm going to call this species richness and bird abundance. I'm going to say bird species richness, just in case I need to remember that. And so these estimates of abundance and richness are what we would call response variables. When we're looking to see how habitat influences birds, the habitat is what we would call a predictor variable, or we also call that an independent variable sometimes in statistics. So these are the variables that we think are influencing some kind of outcome, and that outcome is either abundance of birds or the numbers of different species of birds. And so the bird metrics are what we call Y variables or dependent variables or response variables. I like to use the term response because it makes sense to me. Birds are responding to habitat, which is predicting something about birds. So this is where it becomes really interesting. People can use a lot of complicated statistics and models to try and understand how birds are responding to habitat. But for the purposes of this exercise, and as you're first starting to learn about different ways you can visualize and analyze data, it really makes sense to look and think about your surveys and the data you collected and what you think is important. So hopefully you were really paying attention to what was going on. The purpose of kind of a scouting trip is to give you that practice collecting habitat data and hopefully start to give you a sort of kinesthetic feeling for, okay, how are these two habitats really different? And then you go out and you do your bird surveys and you think, okay, how about what I observed with the birds might be related to what I observed with the habitat. And so I would look at my habitat data set and think, what do I think has a strong influence on bird abundance? And there are a couple ways you might analyze that data. So in another video, I showed you how to do a bar chart with error bars. And the bars were actually some kind of habitat category like conifer or hardwood forest. You might make that comparison. And then what you might do is you could then do another set of bar charts where you're looking at some metric of mean volume or abundance or some mean measurement of habitat in hardwood and conifer. So you could do another bar chart and you could see if your pattern in abundances of some habitat measure was sort of aligned with what you observed with birds. That's somewhat it's not as convincing sometimes to do two bar charts like that as it would be to do something like a correlation. So I'm going to show you how to look for correlation. But you can definitely do a bar chart if that's what you choose to do. You can do a bar chart of habitat data. So I'm going to show you how to do a correlation, and I'm going to look at species. I'm going to look at species richness, and I'm curious as to how it might be responding to something in the environment. And what I have is I have stand type. That would be something that would look like a bar chart, and it could be useful, but I'm really wanting to look for something like a scatter plot. So we have biomass of trees, biomass of snags, biomass of dead woody down debris, lots of other measures like that, canopy cover, tree height, basal area, which is just an estimate of sort of the flat area of a plot that consists of trees, living tree stems, numbers of trees, numbers of snags. And then there are these estimates of richness, overstory richness and understory richness. And so these are overstory richness and understory richness. So this is numbers of trees in the overstory within a certain radius and numbers of different shrubby vegetation in the understory. I'm curious about that. So I think maybe understory and maybe percent vegetation cover might be useful. So I'm going to copy these metrics These might be informative metrics for predicting bird species richness. And I've decided that because I maybe have been out and observed that there were a lot of birds in the understory in certain types of habitat and many fewer birds in the understory in others. And so I think something about what's in the understory, the shrubs, either how much or the types, might have influenced what I observed. So that's why I decided to select those. You may have a totally different scenario. So we have understory vegetation, vegetation cover. Let's try with understory vegetation first. I'm going to actually move this to be next to bird species richness. I'm going to look for a correlation by generating a scatter plot. So I'm selecting these two columns of data. I select insert, the insert toolbar, and then I'm going to select scatter plot. And I immediately get a scatter plot. I first want to retitle it. If you're actually making a scatter plot for an image in like a scientific report, you would get rid of the title and you would make a caption. You would type a caption above it in a Word document or a word processing document. But here I'll type a caption, correlation understory and I want this to be small font. And these might seem like minor details, but they actually make a big difference when somebody's trying to understand what they're observing. I'll make it even smaller so that it just takes up a much smaller part of this area. Okay. Now, I'm going to stretch this graph out a little bit so I can really sort of get an idea of what we're looking at here. We need some axis titles. So if I go over to the right-hand side of my chart, there is this option for chart elements, and I'm going to type in axis titles. And so for the y-axis, I'm going to type in avian species richness. And for the x-axis title, I'm going to type in understory plant. Okay. So now I have a graph that I can understand. I want to put some numbers to this graph, and you can do that very readily. So what I'm seeing in this scatter is it looks kind of like maybe as understory richness increases, perhaps I'm seeing also an increase in bird species richness, which you could make an argument for that. Maybe different types of shrubs attract, certain bird species prefer certain types of shrubs, and when there's more different kinds of shrub, you're more likely to attract different bird species. And so that makes sense. But I don't really have a great idea just by looking at the scatter plot. There's a lot of variation around it. So I'm going to draw a line and see if there's a line with any kind of slope in it. And then I'm going to look at a line equation and a value called an R-squared value. And you do that by right-clicking on your points and selecting Add a Trend Line. You, I think, can also do this using the chart elements. Yes, so I can go into Trend Line. More options. Okay, so I selected just a linear trend line. Looks like a fairly shallow line here. And then I also do want to see that what the equation is and the R-squared value. Okay, and I'm going to expand my graph just a little bit. And I'm going to move these numbers up here so that I can read them. And so what this helps me, it still doesn't give me any kind of hypothesis testing type of statistic, but it can give me an idea of what the line is saying. And so there's an equation, if y'all remember, y equals mx plus b. And here is b here is 13.65. That's our intercept, where this line would cross the y-intercept. And then here is our variable. So for every increase in every one species increase in plant species richness, there's 0.286 increase in avian species richness. So, and that's, if it had been a one-to-one line, we'd see a much steeper slope, but it's a pretty shallow line. And so there's a little bit of an increase. And the R-squared value is 0.1336. And R-squared value is an estimate of how closely the points fit the line. And the points, when they are all exactly on the line, your R-squared value is 1. And when they're a random scatter, you have a flat line and an R-squared value of 0. This is a R-squared value that's fairly low. For ecological data, it's still a little bit on the low side, but an R-squared value in ecology of 0.2, people will notice, and even smaller ones. We'd have to actually run a hypothesis test on this to get a p-value to know for sure. But there seems to be a little bit of a trend here. And so perhaps understory species richness is influencing avian species richness. And if I broke this out by, say, a habitat category, I might find even more information. And so you can do that by adding, you can select more data, and you can add different series of data to a data set if you'd like. Let's just do this one more time with vegetation cover. And I'm going to select now these bird species richness and percent vegetation cover. And I'm going to insert another scatter plot. And it looks like probably I'm not going to get, so I get another scatter plot here, but I'm going to call this one correlation vegetation percent cover richness. You want to label your axes again. My axes, so I'm going to go here. This titles. This is going to be bird species richness. This is percent vegetation cover. Okay. And now I can actually add a line, a trend line to these data. I'm going to do linear again, and I'm going to do an R-squared and an equation. And actually I'm saying here that there's not a very strong correlation. But it's pretty quick for me to get these scatter plots. And so I recommend picking, a series of points of types of vegetation data that you collected that you really think may have described the birds, and try out a few scatter plots. And I would, for presenting it in the homework assignment, I would pick the one that had the highest value, but I would describe the others that you looked at when you're answering your questions. You can also include these others. But in learning to make these and then interpret them is really important.